For 10 years, the wilderness had been my sanctuary. The remote stretch of forest where I built my home was miles away from the nearest neighbor, let alone civilization. It was a place where the hum of city life was replaced by the rustle of leaves, where my only company was the occasional deer or fox. I had poured my blood, sweat, and savings into constructing my cabin, a modest but sturdy dwelling I called my own. The solitude was all I had ever wanted, and it felt like freedom. But freedom, I would soon learn, was an illusion. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. It was stuffed into my mailbox, an ornate envelope embossed with a logo I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from the newly formed Maplewood Homeowner Association, claiming jurisdiction over my property. I stared at the words, barely able to process their meaning. Welcome to the Maplewood Homeowner Association. As a resident within our boundaries, you are now required to adhere to the regulations set forth by the board. Initial dues, $200. Annual fees, $800. Failure to comply will result in legal action. My hands trembled as I crushed the letter into a ball. My land had never been part of any development or community. I had no neighbors, no roads, no amenities that would even hint at the existence of a homeowner association. Who were these people? And how did they think they could claim authority over my home? I decided to ignore it, assuming it was a mistake. That was my first mistake. A week later, I heard the sound of heavy machinery. My stomach tightened as I stepped outside to see a bulldozer carving through the edge of my property. Two men in hard hats stood nearby, casually chatting as if they weren't destroying a part of my sanctuary. "Hey," I yelled, running towards them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the men, a burly guy with a clipboard, turned to me with an air of indifference. "Clearing land for the new community access road," he said. "It's part of the Maplewood Development Project." "This is my land," I shouted. "You have no right to be here." He shrugged and pointed to the clipboard. "Got the permits right here. Says this land is within the homeowner association's jurisdiction. Take it up with them." I grabbed the clipboard, scanning the papers. None of it made sense. The documents referenced zoning changes I'd never been informed about and claimed my property was part of some broader Maplewood development plan. I shoved the clipboard back at him and stormed off to call the number on the letter. The woman who answered the phone introduced herself as Karen, the homeowner association's community liaison. Her voice was syrupy sweet but carried an edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm calling about your so-called jurisdiction over my property," I began. "There's been a mistake. My land isn't part of any community." There was a pause, followed by a condescending chuckle. "Oh, Mr. Carter, it's not a mistake. The association voted to include your property last month. It's for the greater good of the community. Surely you understand." "I don't understand," I snapped. "I've lived here for 10 years without anyone bothering me. I'm not paying your fees and I'm not following your rules." Karen's tone turned icy. "Failure to comply will result in penalties. I suggest you reconsider." The penalties came swiftly. Within days, I received notices for fabricated violations, excessive vegetation, unapproved structure, and even unregistered vehicles. My old truck that had been parked in the same spot for years. Each violation came with a hefty fine, totaling thousands of dollars. Then came the sabotage. One morning, I woke to find a metal barrier installed at the entrance to my property. A sign hung from it, reading, "Private property, no access without authorization." My truck was trapped inside, and I had no way to remove the barrier without heavy equipment. I stormed into town, demanding answers from anyone who would listen, but no one wanted to get involved. "It's best not to cross the homeowner association," one shopkeeper muttered. "They've got connections." Desperate, I turned to a neighbor I'd met once, a man named Rick, who lived on the outskirts of the forest. Rick had a reputation for being a troublemaker, but he also had a knack for digging up dirt. Over a few beers, I explained my situation. Rick listened, his eyes narrowing. "The Maplewood Homeowner Association," he said slowly. "They're in bed with the county commissioners. Heard they're planning a big development project, and your land is smack in the middle of it. So they're trying to force me out," I said, anger bubbling in my chest. Rick nodded. "Wouldn't be the first time. But if they're faking permits and zoning changes, that's illegal. We just need proof." That night, Rick and I crept onto the construction site. Under the cover of darkness, we rifled through a trailer filled with documents. What we found made my blood run cold. Forged signatures, backdated permits, and emails between the Homeowner Association Board and county officials discussing plans to seize my land. Before we could grab more evidence, headlights swept across the trailer. A security guard stepped out of his truck, flashlight in hand. "Hey, what are you doing here?" We froze, adrenaline coursing through our veins. Rick motioned for me to run, and we bolted into the woods, the guard's shouts echoing behind us. My heart pounded as we disappeared into the darkness, clutching the incriminating papers. Back at my cabin, we spread the documents across the table. "This is it," Rick said. "This proves they're breaking the law. But exposing them won't be easy. They'll come after you harder than ever." I looked at the papers, then at my cabin, my sanctuary. They wanted a fight, they'd get one. And so began my battle against the Maplewood Homeowner Association, a battle I knew I couldn't afford to lose. The evidence Rick and I uncovered was damning. Forged documents, illegal permits, and emails detailing a scheme to seize my land were all there. I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly snuffed out by the reality of what I was up against. The Maplewood Homeowner Association had money, power, and connections. Exposing them would be a battle, and I was on the front line. The next morning, I woke to the sound of pounding on my door. Two uniformed police officers stood on my porch, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Carter, we have a warrant to search your property," one of them said, holding out a document. "A warrant?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "For what?" "Reports of unregistered firearms," he replied. I knew it was a lie. I didn't own any firearms, registered or otherwise. But arguing would only make things worse. I stepped aside as they entered, rifling through my belongings. They found nothing, of course, but the intrusion was a clear message. The Homeowner Association was upping the ante. That afternoon, I drove into town to file a formal complaint. At the courthouse, I met a clerk named Angela, who'd seen her fair share of shady dealings. When I explained my situation, she nodded knowingly. "You're not the first to come in with complaints about the Maplewood Homeowner Association," she said. "But they've got their hooks deep in the local government. Most people give up before it gets this far." "I'm not most people," I said firmly. Angela smiled faintly and handed me a stack of forms. "If you're serious about this, you'll need to document everything. And I mean everything. Paper trails are your best weapon." As I left the courthouse, I noticed Karen standing near her car watching me. She smirked, her eyes filled with a smug confidence that made my blood boil. I resisted the urge to confront her. For now. Back home, I began organizing the documents Rick and I had stolen. It was tedious work, but every forged signature and backdated permit fueled my determination. Rick stopped by later that evening, carrying a laptop. "Figured you'd want these," he said, pulling up emails he'd hacked from the Homeowner Association servers. The messages revealed even more corruption. Bribes to county officials, plans to evict longtime residents, and discussions about turning my land into a luxury retreat. The scale of their greed was staggering. The next day I called a local journalist named Emily, who'd built her career exposing corruption. She agreed to meet me at a diner on the edge of town. As I recounted my story, her eyes widened. "If what you're saying is true, this could blow the lid off a major scandal," she said. "But going public will make you a bigger target." "I'm already a target," I replied. "Might as well make it count." Emily agreed to investigate further. But as I left the diner, I noticed a black SUV idling nearby. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. But the unease in my gut told me I was being watched. That night, the harassment escalated. A brick smashed through my window, shattering glass across the living room floor. Attached to it was a note. "Leave or else." My hands shook as I read the words, but fear quickly turned to anger. They wanted me to break, to run. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I called Rick, who arrived within the hour armed with a shotgun. "We'll take shift," he said. "They won't catch you off guard again." The next morning, Angela called with an update. "I found something you'll want to see," she said. At the courthouse, she handed me a file labeled Maplewood Development. Inside were documents linking the Homeowner Association to a company called Apex Construction, owned by a county commissioner. It was the smoking gun we needed. But before I could celebrate, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Drop this or you'll regret it." I showed it to Rick, who frowned. "They're scared," he said. "That means we're getting close. But it also means they'll do whatever it takes to shut you up." As I prepared to take the evidence to Emily, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. The homeowner association had played dirty from the start, and I knew they wouldn't stop now. My fight was far from over, but one thing was clear. I was in too deep to back down. I sat in my truck outside the diner, gripping the steering wheel as I debated my next move. The evidence linking the Maplewood Homeowner Association to Apex Construction was damning, but every step I took toward exposing the corruption seemed to bring more danger. The smashed window, the threats, the shadowy SUV, they were warnings meant to intimidate me. But if they thought I'd give up, they didn't know me. Rick sat beside me scrolling through the emails we'd hacked. "This one here," he said, pointing to a message from Karen to a county commissioner, "confirms they're fast-tracking the rezoning. They're planning to build luxury villas on your land." "Not if I have anything to say about it," I replied. Rick chuckled. "That's the spirit. But we need to be smart. If we're going to take them down, we'll need more than a journalist. We need legal backup." The following day, I met with an attorney named Grace Whitman. She came highly recommended by Angela, the courthouse clerk. Grace was sharp, no nonsense, and not easily intimidated. After I laid out my case and handed her the evidence, she leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "This is explosive," she said. "If what you're saying checks out, we're looking at a massive corruption scandal. But bringing this to court won't be easy. The homeowner association has deep pockets, and they'll fight dirty." "They already are," I replied. Grace nodded. "Then we'll fight smarter. First, I'll file an injunction to halt any further development on your property. That should buy us some time. Meanwhile, you need to keep documenting everything. If they retaliate, we'll use it against them." That night, I returned home to find another message waiting for me. This time, it wasn't a brick through the window, but a spray-painted warning on the side of my cabin. "Leave while you can." The sight sent a chill down my spine. Rick arrived shortly after, his shotgun slung over one shoulder. "These guys are getting bold," he muttered, inspecting the graffiti. "You're sure you want to keep going?" "I don't have a choice," I said. "If I back down now, they win, and they'll do the same thing to someone else." Rick nodded, his expression grim. "All right, then we'll be ready for them." The next few days were a whirlwind. Grace filed the injunction, and Emily's article exposing the homeowner association's corruption went live. The story gained traction quickly, drawing the attention of local news stations and even a state investigator. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning in my favor. But the homeowner association wasn't going down without a fight. One evening, as Rick and I were reviewing the latest round of evidence, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the distant hum of a generator sputtered to a stop. "They cut the power," Rick said, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here, I'll check it out." I watched from the window as Rick made his way toward the generator, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. Before I could react, a loud crack echoed through the night. Rick dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I reported the shooting. "Stay down!" I shouted to Rick, who was crawling back toward the cabin. Another shot rang out, shattering a window above my head. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens scattering whoever had attacked us. Rick was taken to the hospital, and I gave my statement to the officers. One of them, a young deputy named Harris, seemed genuinely concerned. "We've had reports of harassment in this area before," he said. "But this is something else. We'll increase patrols, but you might want to consider staying somewhere else for a while." "I'm not going anywhere," I replied. The next day, I received a call from Emily. Her voice was urgent. "John, I just got a tip from one of my sources. The homeowner association is planning to hold an emergency meeting tonight. They're panicking over the article, and they might try to destroy evidence." "Where?" I asked. "At their office in town," she replied. "But be careful. If they catch you, they'll call the cops. Or worse." That night, Rick and I drove to the homeowner association's office. Despite his injury, he insisted on coming along. "You'll need backup," he said, wincing as he adjusted his crutches. We parked a block away and approached the building on foot. Through a window, I could see Karen and several board members frantically shredding documents. Rick and I exchanged a glance before slipping inside. The office was a maze of cubicles and filing cabinets. While Rick kept watch, I searched for anything they hadn't destroyed yet. In a locked drawer, I found a flash drive labeled Apex Contracts. I pocketed it just as the sound of voices grew louder. "Someone's here," a man shouted. Rick and I bolted. darting through the back exit as footsteps pounded behind us. We made it to the truck and peeled away, the sound of angry shouts fading into the night. Back at the cabin, we plugged the flash drive into Rick's laptop. The files it contained were the smoking gun we needed, detailed plans for the luxury villas, complete with financial kickbacks to county officials. This was the proof Grace and Emily had been waiting for. But as I stared at the screen, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. The homeowner association wouldn't stop now. If anything, they'd come at me harder. The fight was far from over, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The evidence on the flash drive was overwhelming. Rick and I spent hours reviewing the documents, contracts, kickbacks, and emails that painted a clear picture of the Maplewood Homeowner Association's corruption. Grace was ecstatic when I delivered it to her office the next morning. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, her eyes alight with determination. "With this, we can file a case that'll expose the entire operation." But I couldn't shake the feeling that the homeowner association wouldn't go down without a fight. And I was right. The retaliation began almost immediately. First, my phone wouldn't stop ringing with anonymous threats. "Drop this, or you'll regret it," one voice growled. Then a sheriff's deputy arrived at my cabin with a notice. According to the homeowner association, my property was now condemned due to safety violations. Rick paced the room, his frustration evident. "They're trying to force you out before this goes public, but we can't let them." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, though my voice betrayed the exhaustion I felt. The pressure mounted when Emily called with a warning. "One of my sources says they've hired a private security firm," she said. "Be careful, John. They're desperate." That night, Rick and I set up cameras around the property. If they tried anything, we'd catch them in the act. Sure enough, just after midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of engines. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, Rick close behind. 2 trucks were parked at the edge of the property, their occupants unloading construction equipment. "Hey," I shouted, "you're trespassing." One of the men turned, his face obscured by a mask. "Get back inside," he warned, his voice low and threatening. Rick cocked his shotgun, and the men hesitated before retreating to their trucks and speeding off. But the damage was done. Stakes had been driven into the ground, marking my land for development. The next morning, I met with Grace and Emily at a diner. "We need to move fast," Emily said. "The longer this drags out, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Grace nodded. "I'll file for a restraining order and start preparing the lawsuit. But John, you need to be prepared. They'll push back harder than ever." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game." I showed it to Grace, who frowned. "That's not just a threat, it's a warning. Be careful." Over the next few days, the tension reached a boiling point. Karen showed up at the edge of my property with a smug grin and a clipboard. "Just here to inspect the violations," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. I stood my ground, refusing to let her pass the gate, while Rick recorded the encounter on his phone. Later that night, the cameras captured footage of masked men cutting down trees on my property. I called the sheriff, but when the deputies arrived, they simply shrugged. "It's a civil matter," one said. "Take it up with the court." The breaking point came when I returned home to find my cabin ransacked. Papers were scattered, furniture overturned, and the flash drive was gone. They'd sent a clear message. I wasn't safe, even in my own home. Rick helped me board up the broken windows. "They're not just trying to scare you," he said. "They're trying to destroy you." But as I stared at the wreckage, my resolve hardened. "Then we'll hit back harder," I said. "They want a war? They've got one." The next day, Grace called with good news. The restraining order had been approved, and the lawsuit was gaining traction. Emily's latest article had gone viral, drawing the attention of state officials. For the first time, it felt like we had the upper hand. But as I prepared to attend a meeting with Grace and Emily, a black SUV pulled up outside my cabin. 2 men stepped out, their expressions cold and menacing. "We need to talk," one of them said. And just like that, the battle took a dangerous new turn. The 2 men who stepped out of the black SUV radiated menace. Their tailored suits and calm demeanor belied the threat they represented. I stood on my porch, my fists clenched, as one of them approached. "Mr. Carter, we're here on behalf of Maplewood Development," the man said smoothly, handing me a business card. "We'd like to resolve this situation amicably." I glared at him. "If by amicably you mean buying me out, the answer is no. I'm not selling my land." The man's expression didn't waver. "That would be unfortunate," he said, his tone dripping with veiled menace. "It'd be a shame if things escalated further." "They already have," I shot back, "and I'm not backing down." The man nodded as if he'd expected my answer. Without another word, he and his partner returned to their SUV and drove away. But their visit left a chill in the air. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to intimidate me. That night, Rick and I prepared for the worst. The restraining order and lawsuit had put Maplewood on the defensive, but they still had the resources to make my life hell. Rick reinforced the barricades around my property while I checked the security cameras. "They're desperate," Rick said. "Desperate people do stupid things. We need to be ready." "I've been ready since this started," I replied. The next morning, Grace called with an update. "The lawsuit is gaining traction," she said. "A judge has agreed to review the evidence. This could be the break we need." But as hopeful as her words were, I knew the homeowner association wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, a convoy of trucks pulled up just beyond my property line. Workers unloaded equipment, ignoring the restraining order as they began clearing trees and staking out land. Furious, I called the sheriff, but the dispatcher's response was maddeningly indifferent. "We'll send someone out when we can," she said. Rick grabbed his shotgun. "We're not waiting for them," he said. Together, we marched to the edge of the property. The workers barely glanced at us as we shouted for them to leave. Karen appeared moments later, flanked by 2 security guards. "You're trespassing," I said, pointing to the restraining order I'd printed out. Karen smirked. "We have our own paperwork," she said, waving a stack of documents. "Feel free to take it up with the court." As tensions rose, one of the workers moved toward Rick, trying to grab his phone as he recorded the scene. Rick shoved him back, and chaos erupted. Shouts and threats filled the air until the sound of approaching sirens cut through the noise. The deputies who arrived seemed more annoyed than concerned. They separated both sides but made no arrests. "This is a civil matter," one of them said, echoing the same tired line. "You'll need to settle this in court." That night, Rick and I reviewed the footage we'd captured. It clearly showed the workers violating the restraining order, but I knew Maplewood would spin it as a misunderstanding. We needed something undeniable, something that would force the authorities to act. Emily called with a lead. "One of my sources says the homeowner association is storing sensitive documents at a warehouse downtown," she said. "If we can get our hands on them, it could be the nail in their coffin." Rick and I didn't hesitate. Under the cover of darkness, we drove to the warehouse. It was heavily guarded, but we managed to slip inside through an unlocked side door. The air was thick with tension as we searched for the files. Finally, in a locked cabinet, we found what we were looking for: contracts, financial records, and emails detailing bribes and illegal activities. But as we prepared to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the building. Flashlights swept across the walls and voices called out. "Over here!" someone shouted. Rick and I bolted, clutching the files as we raced toward the exit. A security guard lunged at me, but Rick swung his crutch, knocking the man off balance. We burst through the door and into the truck, speeding away before they could catch us. The next day, we handed the documents over to Grace and Emily. Their reactions were a mix of shock and triumph. "This is it," Grace said. "This is what we needed." Emily's article went live within hours, and the backlash was immediate. State investigators launched an inquiry into Maplewood's practices, and the story dominated the local news. But the homeowner association wasn't finished. The final confrontation came 2 nights later. As I sat on the porch, a line of vehicles appeared on the horizon, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Rick joined me, his shotgun in hand. "Looks like they're making their move," he said. The vehicles stopped just beyond the property line, and a group of men emerged, led by Karen and the 2 suits from the SUV. They carried flashlights and tools, their intentions clear. "This is private property," I shouted. Karen stepped forward, her expression cold. "Not for long," she said. "You should have taken our offer, John." Before I could respond, the roar of engines filled the air. Police cruisers and state vehicles pulled up behind the group, their lights flashing. Officers emerged, guns drawn. "Hands up!" one of them barked. Karen and her associates froze as the officers advanced. Rick and I watched in stunned silence as they were arrested on charges ranging from trespassing to conspiracy. The fallout was swift and devastating for the homeowner association. The documents we'd uncovered, combined with Emily's reporting, had brought their corruption to light. Karen and several board members faced criminal charges, and the development project was halted indefinitely. As for me, I finally had my peace. My land was safe, my cabin untouched. But the fight had taken its toll. Standing on my porch, watching the sunrise, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The wilderness was my sanctuary once more, and I intended to keep it that way. "They won't bother you again," Rick said, joining me with a cup of coffee. I nodded. "No, they won't. But if they do, I'll be ready."